Good morning. Today we shall examine Australian short fiction, and in this session we will look at what short fiction is and how it developed in the antipodes. Now, after this session you should be in a position to recapitulate and trace the development of short fiction in Australia, identify the major themes dealt with, and also name some of the prominent short story writers of Australia. Now, as you may have noticed, this is the series that we're doing on Australian literature, and this is the third one. And today we're going to be talking largely about fiction. Now, what is fiction? Fiction is something that is made up or created by the author, the narrator, or the storyteller. It could be a prose piece based on the imagination of the writer and not really on literary facts. Now, fiction has its origins in ancient myths, folk tales, basically in the oral tradition. And Edgar Allan Poe, he was an American short story writer. His dates are 1809 to 1849. What he believed was that the times were changing and people lacked the kind of dedication, the motivation, or even time to read novels. So what he proposed was essentially a short, concentrated story or a brief prose tale. And his views made practical sense, so much so that writers began to adopt and work mainly in short fiction. And there were several writers who collected the anthologies, collected their short stories together in the form of anthologies, and people like William Faulkner, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway, and Guy de Maupassant come to mind. Now, having said that, what we need to do now is to look at the history of short fiction. As I said earlier, the short story. Now, the term that I'm using, short fiction, here basically refers to the short story. Alright? Now, the short story has descended from the following genres. Now, what were those genres? The myth, the legend, the parable, the fairy tale, the fable, the anecdote, the exemplum, the essay, the character study, fabulo, and the ballad. And it was in 1842, it was only in the 19th century, so to speak, that short story actually came to be established and flourished as a genre. Now, what brought that about was in 1842, Edgar Allan Poe, the American short story writer, he reviewed Hawthorne's work called Twice Told Tale. And in that, he defined the short story. He worked out a definition of the short story, even though you must have realized by now that defining literary types is a very, very difficult task. And particularly the short story, it is so elusive and it defies all attempts at classification. But even then, Edgar Allan Poe attempted a definition of it. And what he meant by the short story was essentially a prose narrative requiring anything from half an hour to 1 or 2 hours in its perusal of the tale that concentrates on a unique single effect, and one in which the totality of effect is the main objective. Now, the short story, however, since then has achieved such flexibility as well as variety that it has endless possibilities. And for instance, you could have a short story written about a scene, an episode, an experience, an action, the exhibition of a character or characters, the day's events, a meeting, a conversation, or even a fantasy. Now, the earliest attempts at short story writing were by people like Thomas Nash. Now, if we do not take him into account, then the other pioneers, the early pioneers of the genre were Sir Walter Scott, Washington Irving, Hoffman, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and all these people paved the way for Edgar Allan Poe, who is regarded by many as the first modern short story writer. Now, Poe had a very wide repertoire. He excelled in the detective story. For instance, you have his story, The Murders in the Rue Morgue. Then he also wrote Gothic thrillers like The Pit and the Pendulum. And he also dabbled with an early type of science fiction in his story, The Gold Bug. And he was greatly influenced by the German Romantics and their Gothic stories, and he was particularly influenced by Hoffman. Another major influence in the short story was the Russian writer Gogol, whose story, The Overcoat, affected much later Russian writers as well. Now between the 1830s and 40s, right to the end of the 19th century, there were 3 other Russians and 4 French writers who gained prominence because of their exploration of the possibilities of the form of the short story. Now the Russian writers were Turgenev, Chekhov and Tolstoy, and the French writers were Merimée, Flaubert, Daudet and Maupassant. Now you must be wondering why I'm talking about short fiction in Australia, and I'm going on telling you about what was happening in Europe, what was happening in America, because when we are what we have to realize time and again is that Australia was a penal colony. Its original inhabitants were the Aborigines, who did not have a written script and who lived in the oral tradition. Right? So the short story as it emerged in Australia was largely influenced by what was happening in Europe, what was happening in America, and by Europe particularly what was happening in England. And as you know, in England too, they were being influenced by the French and the Russian writers. So it is necessary for us to look at the general background before we actually come down to the basics. Now we talk about American literature, particularly from the point of view of the development of short fiction and what was happening there. Now in American literature, the period between the Civil Wars was when the North fought the South, the southern states of America, because the South had slaves and the North were for freeing of the slaves and the abolition of slavery. Now this war lasted for a period of 4 years, from 1861 to 1864. Now between the Civil War and World War I, which was 1914, that period is to be considered as the golden age of short fiction in America. Now in America too, as in France, Russia, England, the short, effective, single-blow storyline was becoming very, very important, and people began writing short stories. Right? Now, in American short story, in America, the American short story owes its origins largely to the prose writings of the Puritanical period, which effectively dealt with puritanical propaganda. But that is where the seeds of the short story were sown. And these tales were very, very insipid, often colorless, formless, undramatic, which essentially had one purpose, which was puritanical propaganda. So for a long period of time, for nearly half a century, you had stories like Clarissa or A Pattern for the Sex, The Danger of Sporting with Innocent Credulity, which kept the readers entertained. But this phase of writing was followed by the works of Washington Irving. Now I'm sure all of us must have read Rip Van Winkle in the abridged version or in the full form. Now this was written by Washington Irving. Alright, so the name should ring a bell. Now Washington Irving, what he did was he took off from the moral tale, the didactic tale, from there, but he added to it characterization, humor, ambience and literary charm. And he was essentially a sentimentalist with great regard for the past. So some of his popular works are Salamagundi, The Sketchbook, and Rip Van Winkle. Now the popularity of the Sketchbook, with the popularity of that book, his fame in Europe and England, the descriptions of the lands across the seas, the romance, the vagueness and wonder of it all, captured the imagination of the next group of writers who were to rule the mid-century. And out of these writers, Nathaniel Hawthorne stands out the most. Now what was Nathaniel Hawthorne's contribution to the American short story, taking up after Washington Irving? What Hawthorne did was he added depth, poignancy and soul to short fiction. And what he did was focus on one single situation while creating the effect of a unified whole. He focused only on one situation. Then after Hawthorne, what happened was Edgar Allan Poe was the next great American short story writer to emerge on the scene. Now Edgar Allan Poe, what he did was he brought in brevity, a scientific touch, and he wanted fiction to be very brief, scientific, and as yet able to yield a totality of effect at one single setting and one single sitting. So when you read a story, It should be brief, it should be scientific in its approach, and it should yet give you the effect of being a total finished product. It shouldn't leave you hanging in midair. But his stories are all very, very good examples of, one swift stroke of the brush kind of creativity. But even though he was a very keen observer of life and a good critic, his works lack a sense of human understanding. They lack the depth of human understanding. It appears, when you read his stories, it appears that he was more of an artist who was focusing on formulating the best type of short story to be written, or the best type of technique to be adopted, more than he was a creative writer. And he is located very, very ideally in the history of the development of short fiction in America. He was like the prophet who was looking into the new age. And he was very adept at applying his new perfected art of the short story to old sensational material of the 30s. Now, by the 1850s, a great change had come over short fiction writing in America. The 1850s stood for the dawning of definiteness, of localized reality, of a feeling left in the reader of actuality and truth towards human values. So we have Rose Terry Cook, and her dates are 1827 to 1892, who was one of the most significant writers of this period. Now, she herself was a teacher, and she was experienced with the country districts. So she wrote with a deep sense of knowledge and an understanding and conviction. And she wrote about an area of life that she knew best, that she was familiar with. So she has a long span of writing career, and within that long span, she actually covers the entire transition period right up to the 1870s and the 1880s. Following her, it's Fitzjames O'Brien, 1828 to 1862, and he added the new element of actuality with his short story, What Was It? Then after that, we have Henry James, and with the coming of Henry James, we see the end of the transition period in the development of the short story in America. With James, the short story became an art form, a study of the surface of society, of manners, and of human life. And beyond the brilliance of James and the impressionistic study of situations from a very, very scientific perspective, what has happened is the American short fiction has never really advanced beyond that. Then we have Francis Bret Hart, who was another very powerful force to contend with in American short fiction. Now, by the time Hart began writing, America was ready for local color. And the emphasis which had till now been on the state shifted to emphasis on the nation. So what we have here, what Hart has been doing is he adds to short fiction, apart from local color, a sense of drama. He adds the dramatic effect. And by the 1870s, we have two distinct schools of fiction. One school, which is the school of unlocalized art, that is timeless and placeless, such as the works of Edgar Allan Poe and Nathaniel Hawthorne. And the second school, which is the new color school, or the local color school of Hart, which is seen to be moving towards extremes. Now, the 19th century was also a very, very formative period in African American literary and cultural history. Now, prior to the Civil War, the majority of black Americans living in the United States were in bondage. They were slaves. So their literary contribution after the Civil War, 1864, when the Civil War ended, their literary contribution include numerous poems, short stories, histories, narratives, among other things. And their short fiction, as much of their novel and their other writings, is usually addresses the concerns of women about family, religion, and about slavery. Now, in England, in the meantime, what was happening was, it was the era of Charles Dickens, William Makepeace Thackeray, Charles Reade, and George Eliot. In short, it was the golden age of the later Victorian novel. But even though the novel was so prolific, and these writers were all great novelists, the demand for short fiction did not really decline in Victorian England. And since we have a full course in the British novel, I won't delve too much on what was happening in England. From here on, I'll move on straight to the short fiction in Australia. Now, Australian short fiction, its genesis lies in the records, the diaries, the annals, the journals that were being kept by the earliest settlers or the first people who came to the island. And Australian short fiction has developed through the centuries. Okay, now these things, that records, diaries, annals, journals, were to later flourish and transform into writings like short fiction, novels, biographies, autobiographies, and annals. Now, at the time of the first historic landing, that was 1788 in Botany Bay, what we have to remember was it was the convicts who were transported to Australia, right? And amongst them, the few who were literate were largely concerned with the immediate landscape. Now, the environment, its similarities or dissimilarities from the home country, the seasons, the flora, the fauna, and the people. Okay, the local inhabitants form their main themes. And like I've been saying throughout, since I've been talking about Australian literature, what we have to remember is the people came from England. England is in the northern hemisphere. You have Australia in the southern hemisphere. So logically, everything is reversed in the antipodes or in Australia. For instance, when you have summer in England, it is winter in Australia. Okay, the environment was different. They were faced with very harsh climatic changes, and there were deserts in Australia which English people were not used to. And then you had strange animals like the kangaroo, which was not to be seen in England. And then you also had the eucalyptus tree. In England, trees shed their leaves in autumn. Here in Australia, what was happening was the tree, which is the eucalyptus tree, was shedding its bark instead of its leaves. So they had to contend with a whole host of issues. These are very simple things that I'm really talking to you about, but they had to contend with a whole range of issues which were totally dissimilar to what they were accustomed to in the home country. Now, even within this vast body of writing, some people were still promoting immigration to Australia, while others were decrying. So on the one hand, you have people saying, you need to come to Australia. Australia is the land of opportunity. It is this, that, and the other, praising Australia. And on the other hand, you had a group of people who were saying no, who were decrying what they believed to be the harsh, hostile environment. Okay? And now, as time passed and more people migrated from England, whether forcibly or voluntarily from England to Australia, and they came to inhabit the land, other issues became more and more serious. And most of these men and women were convicts. There were several tales written on the convict system. Among the free settlers, very often they were very poor people and lower class people. And what the genteel women, or women like Mrs. Vidal, who was the parson's wife, what they believed was that these people who came basically to work as servants in the households of the rich in Australia, they did not know anything much. They did not know anything about Christian values. So they had to be taught Christian values in order to make them good human beings. So you also have a lot of didactic stories being written, especially for this lot of people. And then were the original inhabitants of Australia, or the Aborigines. Now, the Aborigines formed an important theme in the writings produced in Australia then. So for some, they were looked upon as noble savages, or even as subhuman beings. So then you have lots of stories being written about how they captured British white women and children, or how the Aborigines were captured and massacred. So you have stories on both these themes being written. But the most important theme for them at that point of time was basically the hardships and the harsh alien natural habitat that they were faced with. So we can trace the development of Australian short fiction in 4 phases, as has been done by Professor Bruce Bennett. He calls the first phase, okay, the colonial phase, that lasted until the early years of the 1890s. Now, during the colonial phase, what was happening was basically they were looking at European and mainstream British models. So you had tales of murder, revenge, mystery, supernaturalism, women's romances being written during that phase. Now, the second phase occurred, okay, when there was national interest being generated. when in the minds of the Australian people they were becoming aware of themselves as a nation distinct from the home country. Nationalism or bush realism as being truly Australian began to dominate the literary scene as well as the short story. Now this was the time when Lawson, that's Henry Lawson, whom we'll be talking about in another session, Henry Lawson and the bush. Now as I told you earlier, bush was the term used to refer to the Australian outback or the vast Australian interiors, alright. Lawson and the bush became inextricably linked together during this phase. And you had lots of stories being written about how people endured the hardships of the bush, and the bush became the symbol of all the hardships that Australia and the Australians had to endure or endured. And similarly, we have Barbara Bayton, who too wrote during this phase, and her stories are told from the point of view of the woman in the bush, okay, the kind of hardships they endure, the kind of dominance, male patriarchy, the kind of cruelty they face at the hands of the men in the bush, particularly in stories like The Squeaker's Mate, which we'll be doing again later. Now, the Lawson type of bush realism, it continued to fire the imagination of writers through the 1940s and 50s as well. Then the third phase is from the 1940s to the 1970s, and this was the time when Australia was forcibly or voluntarily dragged into the Second World War, and it was exposed to international politics in a very big way. So hitherto Australia had been living a pretty secluded, isolated, comfortable life, so far away from what was happening in Europe. But with the Second World War, and because Australia was a British colony, Australian people were recruited to fight in World War II on behalf of England. So Australia was forcibly dragged into the war. And this made Australia realize, and made the Australian writers realize, that they were not really isolated. And they also had friends and neighbors in the East. Now hitherto what you have to realize is that Australia always kept looking back at the mother country. For them, what most of them had in their minds was that Australia was the type of exile that they were being sent into, and eventually they would return to the home country, to the mother country. Now with what happened with the Second World War was Australia was dragged into war on representing the British, and then it also brought in a sense of focus into Australian politics, because they then realized that, hey, there are people to the east of us. All right? We can also be neighbors and friends with them. We don't have to keep looking to our mother country. Excuse me. Now, the aftermath of World War II also made some of the writers very, very nostalgic about the past, and made them long for the early pioneering days in Australia. So most of them went back to writing about the olden days. But what was also happening at the same time, and which was a reality which they couldn't really avoid looking at, was that urban centers were developing. Okay? And there were cities springing up along the Australian coastline. A new urban culture was being created. And then we have writers dealing with the rising urban culture, their problems and issues in their short fiction. So first we had the stage of Lawson, okay, and the bush realism, Lawson and the bush. Then the second phase we have is the developing of cities along the coastline. So we have Sydney and the urban culture. So there are these two forces at work here. And the final and fourth phase of the development in short story, in the Australian short story or the Australian short fiction, could be located post-1970s. And by then, after the 1970s, what we see is that there is a lot of experimentation taking place with both the form as well as the content of the short story. Now, Australia till the 1970s was open for migration only to people of Anglo-Saxon descent. But in 1970s, they changed their policy and they made it open to all races, color, creed. So it became a multicultural, multi-ethnic country. Now with that, what happened was there were a lot of migrants moving into Australia. So we also have several migrant voices emerging, Okay, people talking about multi-ethnicity, people talking about multiculture, migration, and Australia became the new melting pot of cultures, a title which was coveted by America for a very long time. And you have people like Frank Moorhouse and Michael Wilding, who are representatives of the changes that were taking place in Australian short fiction during that period. Now, Wilding and Moorhouse, they too experimented with both the form and the content in their stories, and their stories are sometimes very, very surrealistic and sometimes very discontinuous. So what is happening? From a traditional tale, we are moving towards surrealism and discontinuity. And there were women writers too who contributed to the development of the genre, and some of the notable ones are people like Elizabeth Jolley, Faye Zwicky, and Thea Astley. Now, Australia provided a lot of material for the writers. For instance, the fact that the island continent was largely meant for the transportation of convicts from the mother country. Okay? Or basically what we're talking about is the convict system, the brutality of the convict system. Then we have the bush and the bush rangers. Then you have the Aborigines, the country itself, with its forbidding, bizarre, and extremely fascinating nature and natural habitat. So all of this provided ample material for the writers to work with. And now we can trace the development of Australian short fiction in largely 3-4 phases, and the first phase we shall look at is from the period between 1830s to the 1860s. Now, John Howisson's Tales of the Colonies was the earliest to appear in 1830. And though most of his stories are set in Ireland and the West Indies, there is one particular story called One False Step, which is set in Australia. And now this is the early phase of writing, so it's very obvious and very natural that it will resemble English tales of adventure and crime to a great extent. And this is what the story does. Then we have David Byrne, whose collection, Our First Lieutenant and Fugitive Pieces in Prose, 1842, is better than the kind of story that was written by John Howison. Okay? Now, Byrne essentially was a playwright, and his longest piece, The Three Sisters of Devon, is again very much like the 18th century picaresque novel. Think of Tom Jones when you talk about picaresque. So it is much in the tradition of the picaresque novel, but he had a very, very flamboyant style, and he wrote more by evasiveness and circumlocution. And he was very euphemistic as well. And for the next 50-odd years, most of the writers followed Byrne's model, or his writing tradition. Then you have popular writers such as Mrs. Vidal that I talked about earlier, whose book, Tales for the Bush, 1845. Then you have Mrs. Charles Clancy, who wrote Lights and Shadows of Australian Bush Life in 1854. And Henry Giles Turner, The Confessions of a Loafer and the Captive of Gippsland, Tales of the Colony, 1857. Now Mrs. Vidal, her readership, or the target audience was the lower classes or the servants, and she, as I said again earlier, was the wife of a parson. So she was very, very prone to didactic preaching in her stories. She was trying to make the servants good Christians. She was trying to teach them good Christian values. So obviously his stories are going to have Christian overtones and have a moral at the end of it all. Now there is a story by an anonymous writer which deserves mentioning, and that is the Black Troopers. And why I'm saying that this Black Troopers needs to be mentioned even though it is written anonymously is because it has a lot of similarity to Thomas Keneally's 1972 novel The Chant of Jimmy Blacksmith. Now where is the similarity? Both the stories are a pursuit of an individual, okay, by troopers who are again aboriginal troopers, but they are led by a white man. Even in Thomas Keneally's The Chant of Jimmy Blacksmith, as you may know, if you've read the novel or have heard about it, is a black aborigine who is accused of the murder of a white farmer's family, and he is in hiding, and he is being pursued by the police, who are again And who are the trackers who are helping the police? They are the Aborigines themselves. So the Black Troopers has a lot of similarity to Thomas Keneally's The Chant of Jimmy Blacksmith. Now Mrs. Charles Clancy of Lights and Shadows of Australian Bush Life fame, her stories on the other hand are about people who are either moving from England or who have just arrived in Australia. And she appears to be one of those people who is promoting immigration to Australia or to the colony. Like I said earlier, there were two schools of people, one saying Australia is bad, the climate is bad, this is wrong, that is wrong, and the other group saying, hey, you can come to Australia, it is a good land, it is the land of opportunity. So Mrs. Clancy was one of them. And the tales told by Turner, that is Henry Giles Turner, it seems, when you read his stories, it appears that it's a catalogue of disasters. And this could have been his response, or his writing could be a response to those people who were promoting migration to Australia, or the guidebook novels of the 1840s and 50s, which was promoting Australia in a very big way. Then you have John Lang. And he is one of the first Australian writers before Henry Lawson who dealt with events in the history of the colonies. And from his writings you can gain some insight into the life of the period. Okay? He gives glimpses of the customs, the regulations of the convict period. He talks, but he doesn't really give a detailed social history of the times. But he gives a sense of the atmosphere of what Sydney was like, what other parts of New South Wales was like during the early years of the settlement of the colony. So his descriptions of the landscape, the flora, fauna, are essential to the story, mind you. They're not just mere descriptions that he is writing about what was the landscape. It's not that. They're essential ingredients of the story. And moreover, what he does not do is moralize. Now, women writers in that period, as I said, most of them were the wives of parsons. So they were prone to preaching. So what Lang doesn't do is moralize in his writings. And his stories were published in one volume called Botany Bay in 1859. And though Australian short story writers did not really have good models of short stories to emulate from, or to base their short stories on, the habit of preaching through stories, right from ancient times, what were fables? They were stories with a twist in the tale, with a moral tale. Okay, what were the didactic stories? These were all tales told for a purpose, and that was to teach you better value systems. So all of that seemed to have trickled down to the antipodes, that is to Australia as well. Now, apart from these moral tales, you had stories about Aborigines, the relationship between the white settlers and the black Aborigines, the massacre of whole Aboriginal tribes. All of that came to be major themes. And the other themes that were interrelated to the Aboriginal theme was the capture and the kidnapping of white women and children by the Aborigines, and of the Aboriginal child in the custody of the whites. Now, if you remember, I told you in my first sessions on Australian literature that the Australians had a Native Policy Act which took into custody the children of mixed descent, which meant that if there was a child of a mixed parentage between a white Australian mother or father and a black or an Aboriginal, then depending on the color of the child was classified into a quadroon, a quadricast, octagaroon, all sorts of things, depending on the color of the skin. And if the child was very, very light-skinned, almost fair, had blonde hair, blue eyes, the child would be taken away from the Aboriginal parent and placed in white homes. If the child was half-caste, which meant of a brownish hue and with the features, maybe the features of the Aboriginal tribes, then they were placed in dormitories meant for the Aboriginal half-castes. So that was the kind of system that was there. And these children were forcibly, the children of mixed descent were forcibly taken away from the Aboriginal parent. So there were a lot of stories also to deal with this theme. Now, a third genre that had begun to emerge by the 1860s was also the short story based on historical facts. And among them, you have writers like John Lang, Marcus Clarke, whom we'll be talking about, W.H. Sutton, and Thomas Walker. And the most popular works of this period were Lang's Botany Bay and Marcus Clarke's Old Tales of a Young Country. Now, Prince Warung, or William Astley, he was the furthest removed from the time of the convict system than the other writers were. But as yet, he was able to produce the most vivid and readable stories of all of the convict system. Now, what was happening into short fiction in the 1860s and the 1880s? Now, between 1859 and 1880s, 18 volumes of short stories were published in Australia. And there were three writers who were really prominent during this period. One was Horace Earl, James Skip Borlaug, and J.R. Halding. Now, Earl was prone to writing the guidebook kind of novels, and he dealt with basically the flora, which is the plants, and flora and fauna, which is the animals of Australia. And his short fiction were collected in a volume called Ups and Downs, published in 1861, and most of his short stories are set in the bush. James Borlaug's collection is called Darling Deeds, published 1868, and his stories are stories of adventure, but they are also lacking in characterization. Now, J.R. Halding, he wrote The Old Boomerang, and he is one of the moralist writers. Okay? The stories in his Australian Tales and Sketches from Real Life 1868 are relatively more indirect in their preaching than his earlier tales or than that of the other writers. And the most important writer of this period, however, was Marcus Clarke. And though there were good stories being written before Clarke, these stories never really reached the heights that Clarke's writing was to. Then you had some detective stories, mystery stories being written, but from 1887 onwards, tales of mystery, intrigue, and detection became very popular in Australia. And at the same time, you also had fictional accounts of children being lost in the bush being written. Now, this theme provided the writer with a very wide canvas. Okay, sure, he could write about the virtues of obedience. If you do not listen to your parents, if you do not listen to your elders, you can be lost in the bush, you can be kidnapped by the Aborigines, any such things. So they could write about the virtues of obedience. They could write about the dangers of disobedience. They could explore the wild, untamed Australian bush. They could write about the Aboriginal presence in the bush. Okay, they could delve into human relationships, particularly those marital relationships, and the effects of such a loss on husbands and wives. And Henry Lawson has a very effective tale to this effect, and that is The Babies in the Bush. Now, short fiction in the 1880s and 1890s. Now, in the 19th century, there was an industrialization taking place, even in Australia. There was the development and growth of cities and urban culture. There was a lot of material growth and prosperity, and a loss of pastoral lands. Now, this has been lamented by Christina Stead in her story, The Old School, which we'll do later. And you have, and then you have people like Tasma or Jessie Coover, who wrote ghost stories like The Rupria Ghost. You have P.J. Holdsworth, who wrote A Tale of New Year's Eve or Brushwood Grange. Then you have Marcus Clarke, Rosa Praed, and Ada Cambridge in this period. Now, having said that, what we need to look at next is the Bulletin Years, or the years when the Sydney Bulletin came to be published. Because that was when the short story came to be written in the Bulletin. And the writers associated with the Bulletin were Henry Lawson, his most popular stories being The Drover's Wife, The Union Berries Is Dead, What to Them Geraniums. You have Barbara Bayton, The Chosen Vessel, Edward Dyson, Ernest Forwins, and Prince Warung. Now, they wrote, Lawson was the most prominent of these writers, and he wrote about poignant stories about male bonding, virtues like endurance, courage, honesty, all, and then the will to survive against a very, very harsh environment, equally unfriendly, hostile outback. Those were the kind of things that Lawson talked about. And then we talked about Byrne, who talks about life in the bush, the hardships faced by the women, the kind of cruelty, the dominance that a woman is exposed to in the bush. And then we have another prominent writer who was Henry Handel Richardson, and but she was more well known for her novel, The Fortunes of Richard Mahoney. Then you have people like Catherine Susanna Pinchard, Vance Palmer, Brian James, Frank Dalby, all of them. Then the Australian short fiction in the 20th century. Now the 19th century it seems to be the transition in the history of Australian literature, because it marks the beginning of a reaction away from what had earlier been firmly constructed, firmly planted in the Australian psyche. And they're looking at they're moving away from what was called the Australian tradition, or the tradition of the bush, or the Lawson tradition. So in the latter half of the 20th century, the most notable writing was that of Frank Hardy, and his collection, The Man from Clinkapella and Other Prize-Winning Stories, published 1951. Then you have Judah Wharton's The Alien Son, 1952. Now Judah Wharton, he was a migrant to Australia, and he anticipated migrant writing by some 30 years. Okay, long before Australia had a multicultural policy, and you have multicultural and multi-ethnic voices emerging. Then you have Michael Wilding and Frank Morehouse, as I mentioned earlier. And then you have Patrick White and Hal Porter and Dal Stevens. But Patrick White and Hal Porter, once again, are more popular for their novels. Then there was Peter Cobain, who's The Tins and Other Stories, published 1973, and Mobiles, published 1975, experimented continuously with the short story form. And in his stories, he was largely talking about and exposing the frustrations, the pettiness, and the futility in contemporary living, while experimenting with the form. And Christina Stead, as I mentioned, was yet another big name. Then you have the new fiction, which was largely influenced by contemporary European and American writing, also began to incorporate elements of fantasy, surrealism, experiments with narrative chronology, narrative voice, a new awareness of the role and status of the author in the story, and a generally enlarged consciousness of fiction as fiction, of a story as an artifact rather than a simple reflection of life. But common to all of them is that you have a very, very acute and articulated awareness of there being no simple, uncomplicated relationship between language and the experience that they're trying to convey. And then at this time you also have the emergence of migrant and Aboriginal short fiction. Now, women were writing as well in the 70s, and you have people like Elizabeth Joly and Thea Astley, as I said, and Helen Garner, Craig Grenville, Olga Masters, all of them were writing. Then among the Aboriginal writers we had Kath Walker, Jack Davis, and Colin Johnson. Archie Weller's collection of stories called Going Home was published in 1986 and is the first by an Aboriginal. You had a lot of migrant writing taking place as well. And over the last 15 to 20 years, there's been a shift of interest in Australian literature. Hitherto, the focus was on Australianity, what is really Australian, towards a more locally faced vision of the place. Thereafter, the focus shifts drastically, and if you look at the works of David Malouf, then you will find out the manner in which the shift has taken place. Like he writes his fictional autobiographical works in the manner he does, and then he creates native Brisbane in a very, very different manner. For instance, his 12th Edmundston Street is a collection of autobiographical essays which looks at relationships between places and the self, and the ways in which that relationship can not only be expressed but also constructed. So here we see there's a vast shift in the theme from what was being written in the earliest phase of short fiction to what is now being written even today. Now, in my next session with you, I'll take up individual writers and their short stories, and even there we'll keep going back and forth to what I've discussed today in the short fiction.